Christian parenting.
Welcome to the Called to Love podcast, where we discuss all things adoption and foster care and dive into the practical, the clinical, and most importantly, the biblical perspectives to help you and your family thrive. I'm Summer Colbert, adopted mom, director of adoption and foster ministry, and champion for the Arkansas Baptist Children and Family Ministries. Adoption and foster care aren't just a process. They are both unique invitations to go on a journey with the Lord, where you will experience life-changing opportunities to grow in your faith and learn to love in an entirely new way. One thing is for sure, being called to love means you will never be the same. Welcome back, families, to the Called to Love podcast. I'm so grateful that you have chosen to spend your time with us today. And today we have the privilege of learning all about the ins and outs of adoption from a legal standpoint. And there are so many questions related to the legalities of adoption and so much that new adopted parents don't know that they don't know. That was definitely our case 10 years ago. And so I am so excited to welcome Lucrece Bundy to the podcast today. Lucrece is an adoption attorney and a coach for families who are seeking to adopt. Lucrece, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Summer, for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, when you reached out to me, I just about jumped in my seat because I thought, where were you 10 years ago when we were starting our process? Because you have so much insight and just experience with adoption in general. So as we're getting started today, just share with our families a little bit about yourself and just your heart for being an adoption attorney.
Yeah. So I'm actually originally from West Africa, from Benin. It's a really tiny little country next to Nigeria. And the reason why I say that is just because just from the time I was a little girl, way back then, I remember just dreaming of I wanted to make sure that every child who doesn't have a home would be in a safe home. And this was before I ever gave my life to the Lord and Jesus radically, changed my life. I didn't know that this was something that the Lord had placed in me to do. And so from a very young age, I remember thinking if there's anything I want to do with my life, is to make sure that there are no orphans ever anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And this idea that I had for myself was that I would travel to a third world country. I would build this beautiful home that was kind of like an orphanage, but like a beautiful home. I would literally like scoop all these kids off the street and just put them in a place and have somebody take care of them so they would have food and all of that. So that was my dream for so many years. Then when I gave my life to the Lord, it became very apparent to me that this was actually a calling on my life,
Right.
was to help children, vulnerable children who don't have homes, be placed in safe and loving families. And so then started the journey of me going to law school. I never thought I'd go to law school. It was not the plan that I had for my own life. I
Yeah.
really thought I'd be a missionary in a third world country. I thought I'd be like a Heidi Baker. I mean, I dreamed of just going to Mozambique and studying under her. I was like, I want to be like a little Heidi Baker because of the work that she was doing. Just my heart
Yeah.
was like, oh, yes, I want to go and feed the children on the streets. But that is not the plan that God had for my life. And so he led me down the path of going to law school. And I loved advocating. And it was a natural skill that I had that really got developed in law school. And then after I finished law school, I decided I really want to use that advocacy gift to advocate for children in foster care because it's different here in America. Being from Africa, we have, like actual orphans, the original definition of an orphan. They're literally on the street and they
Right.
really don't have a home, right? But here in America, I realized after being here for so long that the orphans here were the foster kids. And
Yeah.
so I decided to start working in juvenile court and to advocate for the kids in foster care. But right away, when I opened my practice, it really was to help families. And so, one of the misconceptions about adoption lawyers is families just think that adoption lawyers help you adopt babies.
Yeah.
But that's not all true. Adoption lawyers do every other type of adoption that you can think of. So, when I actually started my law office, I did step parent adoptions quite a bit, foster care adoptions, international adoptions, relative adoptions. It actually took about a year or two before I stumbled into newborn adoption and realized that this was literally a whole different world. Like
Yeah.
newborn adoption is unlike any other type of adoption that I do in my law office. So
Sure.
that's kind of the background of how I became an adoption lawyer. It was just the calling that got placed on my life, and he directed me over the years that being a lawyer was the way that he wanted me to do it and being an advocate for those kids.
Oh, I love that. That is an incredible story. And I think we can relate to that on so many levels because a lot of us who have found ourselves as adoptive parents or who might be wrestling with that calling right now, it was like, this wasn't the plan. But I
Yep.
love how the Lord just leads us into right where He wants us. And I really appreciate what you were sharing about the different types of adoption. I think that's really, really important for us to highlight because we think adoption, babies, and that's it. But there's so much more to that. And I want to lean more into that as we have our conversation today, Lucrece. I think as I was thinking about and preparing for our conversation today, and I know you obviously you spend your days answering questions for families, and that's what I do as well. And in my big girl job, as I call it, this is my fun job. But two questions that really come up every single time, and that's how much time and how much is this going to cost? So
Mhm.
I figured that's probably a good place for especially those who are maybe knocking on this door of adoption and they're like, I need to know all the things. So let's discuss both as we get started today. And I think about that question of how long will this take? And that is such a loaded question that's really hard for us to answer. And so I want to give you freedom to answer this based on kind of your experience and what you're seeing in practice. But what I've seen, Lucrece, is there's been this massive shift in the availability of children for adoption, and it's just dramatically changed in recent years. And so as you're answering this question about time for our families, also, feel free to speak into that shift and where you're seeing the greatest need for adoptive families right now.
Yeah, absolutely. What I tell families usually is it may feel like it's very natural to think, okay, God's calling me to adoption, it must be a baby. For of all the families that I talk to, they automatically think that that's what it is, it's a baby.
Yeah.
I challenge that because I think just like I had to let go of the idea of how I thought I was going to fulfill God's calling on my life, I think that families actually need to take a step back and actually ask the Lord, what do you mean when you say adopt?
Mm,
Let's start there. Do you want me to adopt a baby? Do you want me instead of just as assuming that a baby is what God is saying, adoption doesn't equal baby.
that's good.
And a lot of the families that I help, that I work with, this is where we start. I tell them, I know that that's what you strongly believe, but I want to challenge that, and I want you to actually take the time to really pray and
Right.
ask the Lord, do you want me to adopt from foster care? Do you want me to? Is there an orphan somewhere in I don't know some other country? You want me to like how? When you say adoption, Lord, tell me what you mean by that. I
Yeah.
don't want just my will and my understanding to color all of this. And I honestly think that some families just end up running to a lot of barriers because maybe they haven't taken the time to just ask the Lord what type of adoption. So here's a good example. One of
Yeah.
my good friends, they felt called to adoption, but the Lord specifically told them, I want you to adopt special needs kids internationally. And
Yeah.
they had never, I mean, that was never a part of their plan. I mean, they got married, they were going to have their babies and enjoy their lives. Never once did they dream about adopting special needs children. But
Right.
the Lord was so specific with them because it took the time to listen. And so now they've adopted three special needs kids. I think they're one is from Africa, the other two are from India.
Wow.
And they're just through that process, and they've been so refined by the Lord through this journey that they're seeing how this was God's plan for them, but he used the adoption to refine them so much to make them look more like Jesus. So
Yeah.
I tell families, take a step back and really pause. Am I just thinking baby because that's what I hear everywhere? Or is that actually what the Lord is saying when he says adoption? So now, once you answer that question, right? If the Lord says, I want you to adopt an older child from foster care, the timeline differs, right?
Yeah.
If the Lord is really telling you newborn, then the time is going to be different. If the
Yeah.
Lord is saying international, the time for that differs as well.
Yeah.
And so, depending on which path you choose, the timeline and also the amount of money that you're going to spend is going to change. And I think that very basic, like that foundation, is what a lot of families miss when they jump the gun and just go to newborn adoption. It's easy then to lose a lot of money and a lot of time because by
Yes.
the time you make that decision and then you realize, oh, maybe that wasn't the right decision, you have to take all these steps back and then
Right.
start over, right? You've just spent all this time and money.
Great
So I
point.
tell my families, just wait before the Lord and ask Him, God, we just give you, we lay down what we want. Show us what you want for us so that we can fulfill whatever your will is for our lives. So I
Yeah.
hope that answers the question. I mean, I think that when it comes to the timeline and the money, it really depends on in the choice that you make, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I've had families that have adopted a newborn within 12 months, but that's because they knew the steps to take. They had a roadmap to follow, and they knew what to do. They had the information that they needed. It's the power of being having knowledge. And
Yes.
then I know families that it took them 3 4 years. Why? Because they made so many mistakes along the way that it just kept delaying them and delaying them and delaying them.
Yeah.
So my thing is, after almost a decade of doing adoptions, there's no reason why it should take you more than 12 months to adopt. If you have a roadmap, you know what to do, you know red flags to watch out for, and you know what God's called you to do because God is the one who's called you to it. He already knows how it's all going to work out. Um,
Yeah.
it shouldn't take 4 years, unless you're doing international adoption. Obviously, they give you timelines, but
Yeah.
it just shouldn't take you that long.
Yeah.
That's from my experience. That's what I tell families,
Yes.
and usually it's because they've made some mistakes along the way.
Hmm. That's really, really fantastic perspective. Because I've run into and I've been that frustrated mom waiting and like, Lord, you called me to do this and I've done all the paperwork and I'm doing all the steps and I don't understand why it's not working and why the steps aren't clicking and why this isn't happening. And a lot of families quit along the way because they're just frustrated and they're exhausted by the process because we do have to jump through a lot of hoops in terms of the legalities, the documentation, the fingerprinting, the background checks, and all those things. So let's lean into that a little bit, maybe just creating some fair expectations for our listeners, maybe who have not been through this process yet. They're thinking about it. What can they expect, and what are some good ways for them to prepare as they make that decision and they take steps towards a particular path that they feel the Lord is calling them to?
Yeah, yeah. I would say one of the main things you'll hear on social media or Google when you're starting your adoption is people will tell you get your home study done. And I
Hmm.
tell people don't do that.
Yeah,
Do
yeah,
not do your home study first because going back to what I said earlier, if you're not really sure the type of adoption, if you're still kind of waffling back and forth between, I really would love to adopt a newborn, but I'd be open to foster care adoption too. And yeah, actually, maybe I'd look into if you haven't decided that I'm doing foster care adoption, that I know that's where I'm going, or international. If you're still unsure, doing your home study is literally the worst thing that you can do
right.
because if you change your mind later, you'll have to redo your home study all over again.
Exactly.
And so that's so just for families who are thinking about adoption, don't do your home study yet. You need to understand all the different types of adoptions available. You need to spend time with the Lord and ask him like which way he wants you to go.
Yeah,
And then the next thing that I tell families is don't just work with an agency because that's what everybody tells you. So
yeah,
those are probably the number two mistakes I see families make that cost them a lot of money and time is
yeah,
doing their home study and then just assuming that an agency is who they should use because that's what you hear everywhere. And what I tell families is that agencies, you see them everywhere because they have the most money to put out ads.
right.
Whoever can put out the most ads wins, right?
You're right.
But that does not mean that that's the best professional for you to work with, right? There's consultants, there's attorneys you can work with. You can even self match legally. And so all these other ways is worth you taking the time to explore, see the
Mhm.
pros and cons of each and the cost of each, and actually ask the Lord to direct you on which is the best for your family versus just assuming that an agency that, I don't know, somebody on social media used should be
Right.
the one that you should use as well. So those are the two things I will caution families who are starting out right now and thinking, okay, we want to start. What do we do? Don't do your home study first, and definitely don't assume that an agency is the professional that you should use.
That's great advice. I love that. And I want to lean a little bit more into what you said a moment ago. You referred to red flags.
Yeah,
And you're saying, whoever can pay the most for ads is the one that people just we see and we assume. And it's already such a daunting task in our minds, I think, as we're trying to navigate this. And we always call it, it's a very vulnerable calling. And I mean, we're putting ourselves out there and we're welcoming strangers into our homes and into our lives to basically dissect, are we safe people? Are we healthy? Are we, all the things. And so it can be really, really overwhelming and just kind of cause our brains to melt to mush. And so we're like, okay, we'll just go with that one. But
yeah,
that can be really dangerous because we can be taken advantage of as we're
exactly.
willing to write those checks and to go down the path to take whatever steps we're told to do. So,
Yeah.
what are some really helpful things that you could share with us as far as red flags to watch out for?
Yeah, when it comes to professionals, I would say one of the biggest red flags to watch out for is a professional that tells you to sign a contract saying that you cannot advertise yourself, for example. So once you put your adoption profile together, you should have the freedom to be able to like tell your friends and family about it, to be able to post your adoption profile in Facebook groups, Instagram, and
Yeah,
be able to basically, yeah, you have the freedom to let people know that you're adopting. Some agencies actually have it in their contract that you cannot do that. And because
Interesting.
families don't know the right questions to ask, they'll
Right.
just sign a contract with an agency and then find out later on, like, oh, we can't do anything. So basically, your entire adoption journey is now in this agency's hand, and you're
Yeah.
stuck with them. You can't advertise on your own. You can't share your adoption profile on social media. I mean, I would not work with an agency if they kind of tied your hands in that way.
Yeah.
I would say work with a professional who will allow you to still have the freedom. I mean, this is your adoption journey. Don't put your entire adoption journey in the hands of an agency that, I mean, basically now they're running the whole show for you. You know, I just don't think that that's a wise thing to do. God's
Yeah.
called you, and they're supposed to be on your team, helping you to be able to connect with an expectant mother, to be able to connect with that child that you're going to adopt, not to slow you down or slow down your progress moving forward.
Right.
Another red flag I would say is a professional that asks you to give them, like $20,000 up front. You know, if you ever hear a professional tell you that, I mean, just run, don't do that. Most
Hmm.
professionals now will work with you and you can pay as you go. And so most professionals are, I mean, they're understanding that people don't just have $45,000 sitting in their bank accounts to just give you. And
Right.
even if you did, don't do that because then you'll lose all of your money, right? You give them the money and then they're
Right.
like, oh, we used all of it on ads, and we showed your profile to a couple of expectant moms. Just don't do
Yep.
that. So wisdom says, be careful about the professional you use. And then also just, make sure you still have the freedom to share your own stuff on social media. And yeah, so I would say those are big red flags for me. Adoption professionals that have, like really, or some adoption professionals also will say that you cannot contact clients that they've worked with in the past to hear from them. That's a huge red flags too,
Okay.
because you want that transparency. If an agency is saying you can't contact any of our past clients, that
Right.
tells me that there's something wrong.
Yeah.
They're afraid that something is going to come out that they don't want you to know. So
Yeah.
finding a professional that there's transparency, like they put their, information out there, you can contact those clients and say, "Hey, what was your experience with them?" And they can freely tell you what it was like. So
Yeah.
you want to feel free and not feel like you're getting yourself sucked in a deal. That's not going to be great for you in the long run. So
Yeah.
those are a
That's
couple of red
really
flags to watch out for sure.
Those are great. That's really, really helpful. And it is important for us to be able to feel like we have the freedom to make the most informed choice
Mhm.
for our process, for our family, for the expense, for the investment that we are making in this journey, I think is really important. And let's lead into that a little bit more because that's the second question we get is cost. And
Yeah.
it's daunting, it's overwhelming, and it can cause a lot of families to pause and to hesitate and just think, this is impossible. I can't do that. So, what encouragement can you offer to families who have open hearts and they're willing, but they have little to no funding?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that is one of the most common questions that I get is all about the funding. So there's a couple of things about that. The first thing I would say is you don't have to wait until you have $40,000 saved up to start your adoption because that's just going to delay you. Okay. So
Right.
like I said, most adoption professionals now that are decent, that are actually doing work because they want to help, they will offer you like a payment plan. So you can pay as you go type thing. So you don't need to have all of that money saved up. So you can kind of just let that go, let that burden off as long as you're financially stable and you can spend, let's say, I don't know, $4,500, let's say, every couple of months. I I mean, you should be able to start your adoption journey now. You don't need to wait till you have a whole bunch of money down. The second thing that I tell families that I'm still shocked that so many people don't know this to this day is the adoption tax credit. The
Yeah.
adoption tax credit is something that every single adoptive family should be taking advantage of. And I don't know why people don't know about this more. I mean, I talk about it so much and I still feel like I don't talk about it enough.
Yeah.
But the adoption tax credit, you get, I think as of 2023, it's up to 15,900 and something dollars that you get back in tax credit for your adoption, whether it was successful or not. I think that's the highlight that people don't understand. Whether your adoption was successful or not or
What?
not. So that means that if you spent $20,000 this year and you did not have a successful adoption, you can still apply for the adoption tax credit and get up to 15,900 something back in credit for that money that
Stop.
you spent. I'm not kidding, Summer. That's what I'm saying. Like I feel like it's one of the best kept secrets in the adoption world. And I
My
don't know
mind
why
is
people
blown
don't
right
talk about
now.
this. I know. I'm gonna do another video. I literally am like, I don't know how many other videos I need to do about this. Or maybe I'm just not under like explaining it. Whether your adoption is successful or not, folks, listen. So you can get up to $15,000 back for any type of adoption except for step parent. So international adoption, newborn adoption, foster care adoption, you can get up to that money back. So if you spent 20,000, you can get back that credit of 15,000. If you only spent $10,000, then you can only get back the $10,000.
Okay.
So all of your adoption expenses are basically refundable to you when you apply, when you get your, you do your tax returns. You just have to make sure you work with somebody who knows about the adoption tax credit and can make sure that you get it. But guys, that's $15,000 basically that you're getting back, whether
Yeah.
your adoption moves forward or not. So I tell people that because it's one of those like, whew, it just brings this like, oh, I didn't know. I mean, so if I'm gonna spend 30,000, you start doing that. If I'm gonna spend 30,000, I know for sure I'm getting $15,000 back.
Right.
I'm really only spending about $15,000 on my adoption. And
Yeah.
that's really what you're doing, right? Now, the third thing that I tell families is I know that for a lot of families who are thinking, okay, I'm going to save 40,000 and I'm going to work with an agency. Like they're saving up this money so they can work with a professional, right? I like to challenge that mindset because the way that I teach families is actually use the money that you are saving to invest in the resources that are going to help you navigate through the process.
Mm.
That's the wise way to go about your journey because if you spend the time and the money to actually understand the process, to have a roadmap, an A to Z step by step, like this is what I need to do, the first thing that happens there, you automatically just saved yourself thousands of dollars
Mm.
and years in the process. So let me give you an example. I had a family come through my adoption program, Kinsey and Matthew. They had worked with an adoption agency for 2.5 years. They researched for 6 months, which a lot of families are researching. They researched for 6 months. They felt really comfortable with the information they found. They found this agency in Colorado. They felt really comfortable with them and they started working with them. Well, 2.5 years later, nothing. They had never talked to a birth mom. I mean, zero, nothing, like crickets for 2.5 years.
Yeah.
And then finally they thought, okay, we can keep sitting here with nothing, or we can just try something different. And they somehow came across my information, I think on YouTube or something. And they joined my program, started working with me. And then within 12 months, their baby came home. This wasn't because it was like magic. This is because they invested in, like a roadmap. They were like, oh my gosh, we didn't know any of these things when we were researching. If we had known, we would have chosen this other path. And so they decided to self match. And literally, it was like within 12 months, I think they joined in January, December, their baby was home. And it was simply because they understood the process. They knew the roadmap. They knew the red flags to avoid. They knew, the type of professionals that would work with them, the ones I didn't want to work with. And so at the end of the day, Kinsey, she's so funny. She's like, I just wish we would have, done the program before because then it would have saved us all this time. And so
Yeah.
I like to tell families, I know that it seems like if I don't spend this money on a professional, it's like I'm wasting my money. But
Yeah.
actually, if you invest in the right resources, it will actually save you money in the long run and save you a lot of time of kind of floundering trying to figure out what to do.
Hey friends, Summer here. This podcast, Called to Love, is proudly a part of the Christian Parenting Podcast Network. Christian Parenting's mission is to equip parents with the tools that they need to confidently raise the next generation of culture-changing Christians. And right now, that feels more important than ever. Wouldn't you agree? We would love for you to join us in this crucial mission by joining our community of monthly donors. Monthly donations are essential to ministries like Christian Parenting because they help to plan well for the year ahead and create the best content possible. Content like this podcast, printed products, digital guides, and online articles. Your recurring gift, whether $5, $10, $25, or even $50 a month, will help Christian Parenting reach even more parents around the world, encouraging them to be the perfectly imperfect parents God created them to be. To set up your recurring gift, you can go to cpgive.org. That's cpgive.org. Thank you so much for your ongoing support and partnership. Now let's get back to the conversation. Oh, that's so good. My mind is officially blown. That's amazing. And I mean, we benefited from the tax credit when our daughter came home and we finalized that adoption, but I did not know about the failed adoptions. So I'm going to be asking more questions at this
Yes,
point. So that
yes,
is so, so good. You
yes.
mentioned you were talking about, taking different paths and so many that we have. One of the things that I think is not discussed enough is legal risk. And because we kind of set our minds to, okay, we've got this plan. We might even be speaking with a birth mom, or we might be walking through the foster care process or foster to adopt or whatever that looks like. But there's always that legal risk component of this might not happen. So, can you lean into a little bit more and explain to our listeners what legal risk is?
Yes, yes. So legal risk when it comes to newborn adoption, there's actually a couple of different components to that. The first one is no one can ever promise you that mom is not going to change her mind, right?
Right,
So you go into adoption fully well knowing that this could not go anywhere. And
right.
you are, investing in this being fully aware, right? So this is informed consent. You're consenting to this, knowing that it may not go anywhere. Um, the second thing when it comes to legal risk is um, when it comes to the biological father, that's the second component that maybe I don't know is not talked about a lot. You want to work with a professional who is making sure that they're taking care of the biological father's rights as well.
Yeah,
If they're not, that's a huge red flag. You should question that because
that's
an
good.
adoption cannot move forward until both biological parents' rights are
Right.
dealt with. And so if you're working with a professional who's only heavily focused on mom, but they're saying nothing about the bio dad or possible biological fathers, that's a red flag because
Yeah,
that puts your adoption at risk. So that second part of the legal risk is that you are taking in this baby fully well knowing that if a random person shows up, I don't know, a couple months later and they say, I'm the father, they have to be allowed to go through the process of being able to do DNA tests, see if they're really the father, and then see if they have a right to claim the baby. And
yeah,
so you are doing this with all of those legal risks in mind. So that is really heavily for newborn adoption. Foster care adoption is different because the child's parents' rights have already been terminated. So there's no legal risk there, right? We don't have biological parents that we have to take care of their rights. And so there's no legal risk when it comes to foster care adoption, which actually makes it one of the easiest types of adoption in America. So
yeah.
you don't have to, worry about all these things. So I want to tell you, I love telling stories because they're just so great.
I love
So I
it.
tell you a story about this case that I had about 3 years ago. And what happened was this family, it was, I think, a family friend was wanting to place the baby for adoption. That's how they connected. And so they decided, okay, we'll adopt the baby. They went to the state, picked up the baby, came back to Nebraska, and the mom actually she lied on her affidavit and she said that the boyfriend she was with was the biological dad. And then come to find out he wasn't. And the boyfriend also signed an affidavit saying that he's the biological, even and he knew he wasn't. Well, my clients came home to Nebraska with a baby. We thought we had all these things done. And then we hear the attorney for the mom calls me like at 2 months later or something. And she says, some guy just showed up, called me, and he says that he is the bio dad, that he was the one with the mom, 6 months ago before she had the baby. And
Mm,
he knows that he's the father and that she was just trying to keep the whole thing away from her or from him. And then come to find out, he was right. The mom intentionally tried to place the baby for adoption without telling him.
wow.
And so that's another part of legal risk, right? You could have a mom who is not telling the truth. And there's only so much that a professional can do. Like whatever mom is
Right.
telling you, we still have to do our homework, right? I mean, I ask my clients very pointed questions and make sure they understand that if you are lying here, this is going to impede the entire adoption. But
Yeah.
some moms still don't tell the whole truth. So that's another part of the legal risk that you're taking is there could be a biological father that comes out of the woodwork later, and mom just lied, and now you have to deal with that. And
Yeah.
so I would say those are all kind of the different components of legal risk when it comes to
Yeah.
adoption.
Thank you for explaining that. That's really, really helpful because it's things that we just don't think about. We have this idea of it's just going to be very cut and dry, and there's a lot of complications that can arise. And we don't share that to discourage, but to inform. And that's the purpose of this conversation. Really, is to equip you with a lot more information than when you first hit play on today's episode, right?
Yeah.
And I think
Oh,
let's lean into. Go ahead,
sorry,
please.
I was just gonna say there's one more that I think that the listeners should know, which
Yeah.
is just not talked about a lot, which is ICWA. I don't know if you guys have heard of ICWA. ICWA is the Indian Child Welfare Act.
Yes.
And it deals with Native American children. And a lot of people get shocked when they're maybe, connected with a mom who is like a Native American and her child is Native American. And it's like, oh my gosh, it's a whole new process we have to do. ICWA
Yes.
is basically, to make it super, super basic, this, changes from state to state, but generally, if a Native American child cannot be placed for adoption unless the tribe that they're registered with is given the opportunity to say yes or no. So the
Right.
tribe gets the first say. So that's why sometimes, people that are maybe placed with Native Americans are shocked, or they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know there was this extra layer. It's because of ICWA.
Yeah.
An adoption cannot happen until the tribe is notified and they get to choose to either take the baby, and if they choose that, then you have to give up the baby to the tribe, or they can say we give up our right to this baby and now that baby is free to be adopted. So there is that extra layer too of legal risk when it comes to ICWA specifically that a lot of families just don't know about.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up and shared that. We actually are working with a family who's walking through that right now in the
Oh
foster
wow,
care
yeah.
system and all
Yeah.
of that. And so it's an added layer. And so it's really, really difficult. And my heart goes out to our adopted families, Lucrece, because I know how this feels where you're just like, my heart wants this so much and I want to embrace this so much. And then all of these complications start coming in and we feel like we're kind of tripping over them. And so I feel like if we establish the expectations of, hey, this may not happen, but it is a possibility, then maybe that'll help us to deal with it when we're presented with these different situations as you've described for us today. One of the other things that I really want to highlight that I think is really important is the differences and the legalities around open versus closed adoption. For families, there's a lot of agencies that they really push and sometimes require open adoption as a part of their agreement in working with families. And then there's others that allow the biological family's choice in that matter. And so speak into just kind of some of the rights on the side of the adoptive parents and for the biological families on open versus closed adoptions.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, open adoption is really something that both parties have to be open to. And the way that I look at it is at the end of the day, the mom is really the one making that decision, right?
Right,
Like, you're not going to be matched with her if she wants open adoption and you want closed adoption. It's just not
right.
going to happen. But if you are open to open adoption and she is too, and you get matched with her, now it's really up to you what open adoption looks like for you. There's not a specific, like, set of guidelines. It really is how open do you guys want to be? Like, how much contact does mom want to have with the baby? That's really where it starts. The first
Right.
question that when I work with birth moms here in my law office and I represent them, that's the first question I ask them. Tell me what contact with your baby after adoption looks like for you. What would you like to see happen?
Yeah.
And the birth mom is the one who tells me what she wants. And then I relay that over to the adoptive parents. I mean, I'll counsel her and explain to her what's reasonable or not, right? Like,
Right.
we can't have a co parenting situation where you are wanting to see the kid every week, or like we have to be reasonable about it. And so she
Right.
tells me what she wants. And then, kind of we talk through that process of how to make it more reasonable. And then I relay that over to the adoptive family to their lawyer. And then there's kind of a back and forth that happens until both parties feel like, okay, we're both happy with the plan that we've placed together.
Yeah.
So that's the way I see open adoption is it's really a back and forth between the parties until you come up with something that you both feel very comfortable with, that you're like, we know we can do this long term. It
Yeah.
doesn't feel like a lot to do. So I have a family too, for an example, who they adopted a baby boy last year through my program, and then they adopted another one just recently. So excited for them. But so what they did with, I was representing the birth mom. What they did here was with the second one is my client was asking for, I can't remember. I think it was like once every 3 months or once a month or something. And they just politely said, hey, we already have this visitation set up with our first adopted son. And they wanted to keep it to where both kids were having kind of similar visits and contact with the biological parents so
Yeah.
that one child wouldn't feel like, well, they get to see their biological mom more than me. And so they were
Right.
coming from a place of like, we just want to be fair to both of our children. And
That's
it
good.
wasn't, yeah, it wasn't like, we don't want to give this to you. And so
Right.
I was able to bring that back to my client and say, okay, this is the reasoning behind it. And she was like, oh, I completely understand. And so the massage back and forth. And then we finally had, a contract, an agreement that they both worked with. So again, it really is tailor to the parties, to what the mom wants, to what the adoptive parents feel comfortable with. And there's so many other factors that can play into open adoption. But I'm a strong, strong advocate for open adoption. There's just so much research that has shown how good it is for adopted children to know from the get-go that they're adopted, to be able to have a connection with their biological family from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, to be the best adoptive parents that we can be, we just need to know that that's really important for adopted children to know where they come from,
Yeah.
and to have just that open door that whenever they have questions, they can get those questions answered, and they
Yeah.
don't have all these questions when they turn 18 or whatever about and have an
Right.
identity crisis. We don't want our children to go through that, you know? You want them to be
Exactly.
solid in their identity from the get-go. Even if they're adopted, this was just part of God's plan for you. You're still loved, you're still cherished. We love you, and you don't ever have to feel like you don't know who you are, you know?
Yes.
Yeah. So open adoption, I also advocate for an agreement, a communication and contact agreement, because it makes the biological mom feel a lot better knowing that she has a contract with you. I usually recommend for adoptive parents to be open to that because it gives mom peace of mind that you're actually going to follow through.
Right.
So if you sign this contact agreement, it doesn't mean that mom can just change her mind with the adoption. It does mean that she can hold you to the contract, right? So if you say, we're going to do a visit once a quarter, and then you kind of fall off the wagon, she can sue you in court for that. She can sue you to enforce what you promised her. That gives
Mm.
her peace of mind. And I think that it just also holds adoptive parents to a higher standard, and to just be a person of integrity, just
Yeah.
stick with your word. This is important.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I would say about open adoption.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I
Mhm.
have to ask this question just along those lines for on the side of the adoptive parents, what does the law require or what is the approach if at any point the biological family becomes unsafe for the child to interact with as they grow?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's actually a provision that's added in the communication agreement, at least the ones that I draw up. There's a provision for all those kinds of things. So there's a provision for if the biological family becomes unsafe, or they're starting to do drugs or alcohol or anything that's going to threaten the safety of the child, it now gives the adoptive parents the right to hold back visits or the right to not do visits at all. So there's usually a provision in the contract. So as an adoptive parent, make sure that your attorney, if they're drafting of that agreement, that you ask them to put something like that in there so that you have there's safeguards around you. So if
Yeah.
mom is showing up drunk, or dad is showing up, on drugs, if they're high, that you can say, well, based on the contract, I can stop the visit.
Mm.
And when you get clean, let me know. So it keeps you safe and also the child safe, because you definitely do not have to keep doing visits if the biological family becomes unsafe for you and for the child.
Okay, that's so good. I feel like I
Mhm.
try to ask all these questions based on what our listeners might be thinking right now as they're listening
Yeah.
to everything that we're talking about. And I know that y'all probably have a million more questions for Lucrece. And I have good news for you. She coaches families and she has resources available for you to connect with her. And so, Lucrece, I want to give the opportunity for you to share about those resources and how our families can connect with you further as we're closing out our conversation today.
Yeah, oh, thank you so much, Summer. Yes, I love helping families through this process. It's a joy to see the light bulb come off, and come on for them as they're going through the process, and to see so many families even like change their mind. Like they'll start with, I want to do newborn adoption. And then after going through the program, they're like, oh, actually, it's foster care adoption we should be doing. Like it's
Yeah.
just, or seeing their babies come home. It's like the most amazing thing.
Right.
But anyway, so I provide the Adoption Success Accelerator program. And what it is it's an unbiased, streamlined source of everything that you need for a successful adoption before, during, and after. And I also personally guide you through it based on my experience as an adoption lawyer, helping hundreds of families through the process. So all you have to do is go on my website, lucrecebundy.com, and I think there's a tab up there for the Adoption Success Accelerator. And you can apply there to join the program.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
going to have that link in today's show notes. So as soon as you're done listening to today's conversation, head over there and check out that program. I think that is fantastic. Like I said, I'm frustrated that I didn't have this 10 years ago because this is such a valuable resource for someone with your credentials, your experience, and your heart, especially to help families navigate this journey. So I am so grateful to you for just your willingness to reach out, to connect with me, and to share with our families. This has been such a valuable conversation. I'm sure there will be more to come. Listeners, if you've got more questions that you'd like to send in, please reach out to me at the email address in today's show notes, or you can find me on social media. Connect with me there, and we will have a follow-up conversation. Lucrece, you up for that?
I would love that. I would love that. Bring the questions.
Let's do it. I love it. Okay, listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. And Lucrece, thank you so much for being my guest. It has been such a pleasure.
Oh, it was an honor, Summer.
Thank you so much for listening to Called to Love today. I love to hear from listeners, and so I would love to connect with you to hear your stories and answer your questions right here on the show. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram, send me a direct message, or send me an email at the link in today's show notes. I pray you have been encouraged by today's episode to walk in faith and continue to embrace your own call to love. Until next time, blessings, sweet friends.